So now you have to take all the things you hardwired in, like, are you a high risk or a low risk investor? Are you married or not married? Are you this? Are you that? Are you that? All these things that we turned into either binaries or degrees. And then we made a whole bunch of assumptions on people after. And we have to go back to first principles, which is if you were having a conversation with someone and trying to understand what mattered to them, why it mattered to them, and what they wanted to do because of what mattered to them, you would not start with a checklist. You would not start with a static data model that you were trying to fill in. You would listen to them and you would ask questions and you would respond based on what they said. And you would give them scenarios and they would respond, and it would happen over time. Trust would be built and more questions would be asked. Questions would turn into actions and then more trust would be built.
Welcome to Knowing Me, Knowing You, the podcast for the future of wealth management. Thanks for being here. I'm Marla Sofer. Money is a tool. It empowers people. Let's dive into how technology is personalizing advice, strengthening connections, and creating lasting impact. If you're an advisor looking to differentiate, a fintech leader shaping the next wave, or a client ready to take control of your financial future, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello. Today, we are thrilled to sit down with Kendra Thompson, a 25-year veteran of the wealth management industry with a proven track record of helping the largest global players navigate their biggest transformations. Kendra is passionate about the power of advice and how it opens doors, creates access, and drives financial well-being for individuals and communities. She has had leadership roles at Merrill Lynch, HSBC, Raymond James, Accenture, and Deloitte, all in the service of shaping the future of advice and investing. Now, as the founder of Epok Advice, Kendra leads a boutique firm advising financial services firms, executive teams, and boards on growth strategy, M&A, high-performance sales, and operational excellence. She is at the forefront of AI, digital transformation, and fintech disruption, serving as an executive advisor to private equity and startup leaders. Today, we're going to dive into the real forces shaping the future of wealth management, what firms say they want versus what they actually do, how resistance to change is impacting the industry, and where the biggest opportunities lie for firms that get it right. Kendra, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the Knowing Me, Knowing You podcast.
Marla, that was a wonderful introduction. I'm going to have you follow me around. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's funny how many people say that. They're like, is my mom listening? I hope so.
I feel like you should enter every room right before me.
I would be thrilled to enter every room before you, especially when you're talking to shared customers. That'd be good. So we always start with the same question on this podcast. It's kind of to set a tone of optimism and where we are and where we're heading. So what excites you about the moment we're in right now for the wealth management industry?
Oh my God. Well, I'm a real nerd for the industry. It's my passion. And I think I would classify myself as often excited. You know, at the heart of our industry is a conversation between individuals, their families, and people that they trust. And those conversations really matter. I think they matter to those individuals and they matter to our economies more broadly. So I think one of the things I'm really excited by is really seeing the incumbent industry and the emerging tech industry support those conversations in much more innovative and exciting ways. I love that we've left behind this, is it human or is it technology? Is it robo or is it advice? Is it wealth tech disruptors or incumbents? I love that I feel like we're really entering a time where it's really about bringing the best of what's possible together, and that we're no longer debating whether people need advice or whether or not we can procure advice to them at scale. We're spending way more time as an industry figuring out how to do it with excellence. And I think that's a much more fun, much more rewarding use of everyone's strategy dollars and energy.
Yeah, I love it. So you're talking about this convergence. We were looking at this choice between two options for many years, maybe even over a decade. And we're at this point of incumbents and emerging tech coming together. What I love about some of the conversations we've had before is your perspective and coming from deep within the industry, recognizing that we've been talking about various strategies and services for a really long time. And the headlines have said, here's all the great things that the companies that embrace these industries say they're going to do and what they intend to implement. But you've been in there, you've been in the weeds, and it doesn't always pan out that what they say they're going to do or what they believe in is actually what happens. So how can firms better align their offering with actual client behaviors and needs, the what they say with what they're really doing to implement the things that they're aiming for?
Yeah, and I'd probably answer that in two ways. There's the part related to the client experience or the advice offerings themselves, and then there's the part related to the untapped potential or the transformations that ought to be, or in many cases are underway. So as it relates to offering, I think the promise almost always is out ahead of the full realization and the full ability to deliver. And that's just a reality in a fast moving, competitive environment. You want to be able to say that you're, for instance, aligned to the outcomes and benefits of your clients. You want to be able to say that you're the best offering or you're the best partner. And it almost manifests itself as you make those promises and you commit to them in the space. We've struggled to fully deliver on those things for a number of different reasons. One, just the complexity of changing individual behavior and changing organizational behavior. Two, the technology limitations that up until very recently were meaningful and made the promise always a little less realizable than the reality. And three, we have for some time had this debate about to what degree are we designing for an emerging type of investor versus protecting the investors that are already installed. Some of that shift is already really moving in the direction of really realizing on the promise of fully personalized, fully tailored, fully connected on-demand advice. And, you get this sort of wave of promise followed by some of the realization, some of which meets the promise and some of which falls a bit short. And then you have iteration within it. I think we're in an iteration stage as it relates to offering. As it relates to what does it actually take to pivot these organizations and do that promising in a profitable way, we're not quite as far along. I think we spent a huge amount of energy as an industry focused on whether something was physically possible, whether the capability existed, whether we could promise it, whether we could design it on the interface level. But we haven't spent as much attention on what does it really take to do that profitably in a differentiated and defensible way at scale. And that is way less exciting to the lay person. It's way less likely to come up at a dinner party, but the bowels and the piping of our business has been underinvested in for some time, and getting that addressed and getting everyone into efficient operating models with the right data, the right technology infrastructure, and the right cost profile. That is the second part of being able to deliver consistently on the promise. And I'm seeing us struggle a little bit more with that side of the equation.
So it's really interesting. I'm hearing this really interesting analogy between how you're talking about businesses and behavior change, tech limitations, evolution, running their business and looking at what is the purpose of the business and making sure that they are aligned with generating profits and issuing value to their stakeholders. And I can't help but see an analogy to how Nomi actually powers that for individuals and kind of brings about that data for individuals. It's all about the behavior change. And so question I want to follow up on is, where are you seeing resistance to change? So you offered kind of a really great overlay, and you kind of said, here are some of the things that we've done. Here's how it's changed over time. We've kind of gotten a little bit better in this area. This area still needs a bit of work. Where are you still seeing resistance when you're talking to leaders where they're like, they want to achieve client incomes? And then where do you see that there are strategies that they can employ in their organization to address and kind of move that resistance into things that will help them find profitability?
Well, so humans are humans, whether they're working in wealth management or not, right? And so there's resistance to change because I'm comfortable. There's resistance to change because I don't have much more trajectory in my career. There's resistance to change because I don't know if I have the support of my organization, and all those natural human inertia type feelings exist. What I see is the reality of running the business day to day is often in some degree of healthy and sometimes unhealthy friction with the reality of changing the business. And so the way I like to describe it is like my clients are often dealing with the messy reality of operating. And as a result, they are cautious about what they promise and take on as it relates to changing the tires on a moving car, right? And I think that's prudent. And the people who have been successful over time have struck different versions of a balance related to how much they're willing to take on as it relates to change while still delivering in-year profit and progression for their people and all the promises they've already made in their day-to-day. That tension is healthy, because we know we don't want to start from blank pages, and we know that these are profitable businesses in many cases. There's another resistance to change, which I believe is waning a bit, which is belief. And for a very long time in my travels, I would meet with boards and executive teams, and you could just see that some of the more established leaders were suspending disbelief. They suspended disbelief on digital. They suspended disbelief on millennials. They suspended disbelief on women. I'm seeing less of that type of resistance, like intellectual resistance or unwillingness. The way I sometimes describe that is the difference between the why versus the how. So I think we have spent an inordinate amount of time as an industry discussing whether something matters or why we might do something. And now more of the focus is on how. Everyone's moving in variations of the same direction towards holistic, digitally enabled, fit for situation, fit for person advice. The question now is how? How do you take what you're already doing well and pivot it? What do you need to complement it? And how do you do it in a way that's going to stand out in a market where, frankly, anyone sitting in a financial services organization is coming to the realization that the most defensible part of your value proposition is the advice component. You can't differentiate on price or product as much as you can differentiate on rich conversation. So I think that inertia is shifting. It's still there, but I would say it's way less of an intellectual block about the importance of being in the right conversations with the right customers in the right way. And it's much more about how to step into it and what to stop doing in order to make space for what it's going to take to be delivering really amazing experiences to tomorrow's investors.
It's refreshing to hear, and I think eye-opening, because working in the industry, when you think about, okay, the reality we were in was they were suspending disbelief. There was a inherent tension with integrity. They said they were doing things, but they didn't actually believe in it. They kind of were listening to parts of the reports and data coming out of a lot of consultants in the industry that were saying, no, these are real trends. They're things you should be paying attention to. And now, just with the turnover and everything you're saying, there's more realization. There's more integrity in, no, these are real. There's belief there. I want to go back to your focus on profitability and just running an effective business. And one of the things that you've talked about with respect to taking that wealth management part of the business and effectively monetizing it for a broader swath of clients. So how can firms scale these offerings, which historically have been low margin, kind of high cost, for emerging client segments? And is the future of wealth management leaning towards the incumbent firms that are adapting, or is there room for new entrants to disrupt as we're still looking at this expansion into broader segments?
Okay. And it's important for me to disclose that I have very strong and very widely discussed point of views on these things. So this is like the Kendra Thompson perspective on some of these hot topics. So the first thing is I'll answer the last part of your question. In general, I believe the future of the industry sits with the subset of incumbents that choose to modernize at pace. I do not believe that the future of the industry sits with disruptors. That said, there are some excellent disruptors, and I see them both having success and momentum that I champion and celebrate, and I see them inspiring those early movers or those more willing to move incumbents. I see many of them pivoting to become service providers or vendors. So that's the first thing I would say very clearly. Like in general, if I were going to bet, I would bet on the incumbents that show appetite for change and show leadership as it relates to the future. The second thing I would say is that this idea of scaling advice is not just a nice to have. To me, this is an absolute imperative. Nobody should be left behind as we modernize. And in fact, we are already excluding huge swaths of the population in North America, whether it's because they don't have enough money to invest in the first place, like they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they haven't saved, or they're not getting good financial 101 advice, or because they can't or don't know how to gain access to like really good personalized financial advice, or whether they're just deemed as unattractive because they're either high touch needs don't match the amount of assets they have to invest, or their low transaction behavior doesn't meet the model they've been pushed into. For years, what we did is we thought about people as mostly just depository. And then one day you get a little bit of money from either a windfall or accumulation. And all of a sudden you become a wealth management client. And then we graduate you as you accumulate wealth, and we give you more and more service as you graduate. And we always sort of had it set up as binary. You either needed no advice or you paid for advice all the time. Those paradigms of our industry are unsustainable and are being challenged by investors themselves. And I think ultimately the next generation of services really needs to answer that challenge. How do you get access to the right advice that you need in the right way when you need it, in a model that is designed to meet those needs, not ignore those needs, but do so in a way that's at the right price point and profitable? In general, we have the beginnings of the answers of those questions, but they're mostly being built within the very graduation silos that we need to break down. So said differently, any universal bank, any scaled incumbent has the answer for what to do with someone before they have money to invest, or what to do with someone when they only need advice some of the time. But the answer breaks the paradigm or the structure that they have in place for their channels and their go-to-market. So the industry's challenge now is to say, how do I take those component parts that I either built in a channel or built in a sub-offering or built in a sub-brand or built in a monoline business and redeploy it in more flexible and more on-demand ways? And this especially matters to sort of the 1 million invested and below types of profiles, which is a huge portion of the population. Sometimes you'll only need advice as it relates to a 5-year plan. Sometimes you'll only need advice related to a moment in your life. You shouldn't have to repaper or switch in order to get access to that advice. So we need to think about advice as not just being at the front end of a relationship, not just being asset allocation and product selection for financial service product sales. We need to think of advice as encompassing both sides of the balance sheet. And we need the retail bankers and the insurance leaders at the table helping us design advice for the everyday investor. We need to start thinking about ways in which patterns or common situational advice can be delivered separately from personalized, tailored, more fit for person advice. And then we need to understand how to monetize advice experiences outside of transaction. Because many times when people need advice, they don't need a transaction. They don't need a new product. And that's part of where the profitability breakdown takes place. So one of the best ways is to fight for primacy. So as you become the prime relationship for any investor, you're more likely to have multiple products with multiple different profitability profiles. And by having that, you can take a risk or you can make the decision, provide situational advice without there having to be a transaction on the end. Part of that is scaling the commodified components. So one of the best things that's come out of digital and robo offerings is really excellent digital first experiences related to asset allocation and product selection. That's not the end of the advice they need, but those commodified pieces we should deliver at scale. And then creating simpler ways for non-dedicated advice or validation within the systems that are viewed as less hands-on. So the am I okay or did I do the right thing type of advice does not need a dedicated multi-decade relationship. It often just needs the right person listening at the right time. And then the last thing, which is now no longer as difficult as it has been for years, is taking an institutional view of individuals. Instead of saying the only way you can get good personalized advice is if you get to know Marla and tell her everything, thinking about all the conversations that investors have with the Marlas and the Kendras and the Johns at an organization, and ensuring that that data does not leak out or get ignored, or that we're not losing the potential to create rich profiles and rich insights around individuals and their families.
What if financial planning wasn't just about numbers, but about you, your values, your goals, your vision for the future? Nomi is transforming client discovery for wealth managers, going beyond assets and risk scores to uncover what truly matters. With behavioral insights and real-time data, Nomi helps advisors personalize advice, build deeper connections, and grow their businesses. Because the best financial decisions start with knowing you. Discover the future of client engagement at nomi.com. That was a perfect layup for talking about Nomi, but I want to come back to one thing and a question that I have that synthesizes some of what you're sharing. So we talked about resistance, we talked about the shift in incumbents, and you talked about, look, I think it used to be about suspending disbelief. It's not about that anymore. I'm curious, when you think about how incumbents are looking to embrace this opportunity, and they're thinking about, do we build, do we buy, do we partner? And there's that kind of element of, do we look outside of our own four walls as a institution, but there's also the internal org structure and the internal incentives. And you said fights for primacy when you think about who really owns that client relationship. And I know what I've come across is sometimes there's internal fights for primacy. Which entity and which organization is kind of the owner of this client relationship? And that sometimes creates internal battles where you think about who is the primary that this one individual interacts with the most. So I'm wondering, how do you see the org structure and the incentive models in these very large corporations evolving to embrace this beautiful promise and vision that you've laid out?
Okay, so I have so much detail I could provide on this, but maybe I'll try to treetop it, and then you'll let me know if I'm hitting the right thing. So legacy of the industry, organized by product, verticals, channel silos, often with clear graduation points, internal competition, and a very specific set of boundaries. Generation one is you start to align those adjacent silos under a single executive. And I would say pretty much all of the leaders across North America and the world have done that. They're in maybe version 1, 2, or even 3 of a more integrated operating model that brings the businesses that matter most to investors or to specific profiles of customers in under a single executive. Then the question is the degree to which that executive and their transformation mandate can start to break down those internal silos. And we've seen varying degrees of success there, where some have chosen very deliberately to blow up the operating model and redesign it with, like, for instance, customer profiles. And we saw actually a lot of that in the mid 2010s. And then some of them have chosen to go very much based on, affluency or asset criteria. And there's no right answer, by the way. But ultimately, what you start to see is there are grays and there are overlaps no matter which way you do the operating model. So then it becomes the degree to which you can look at your own organization from the outside in and say, here is the customer and here's what the customer expects, needs, and wants from our organization. And this is us breaking our own self down to deliver that. And in many cases, it was easier to do that type of work with born new or net new customers than it was to look at your most profitable, most instantiated clients and try to blow up what was already their service model. So what you'll find is there's some really great examples of that outside in for young people or for newer profiles of customers. But when you get into the most attractive customers, you still see all that competition and cannibalization that you mentioned. And then we get the benefit of technology that started to enable consistency regardless of which employee, licensed or otherwise, was interacting with the customer. And when you see the first generation of those experiences, the rules were hard and fast. Like, you would only get this type of an experience from your private banker. You'd only get this type of an experience from a retail leader. You'd only get this type of experience from a commercial banker. The organizations that are on the leading edge have had that up and going for a while and iterated on it enough and realized that within an attractive profile or within an emerging profile, there's variability on who they want to have serve them and the degree to which consistency in the people serving them matters to them at all. And it's through iteration that they're starting to realize we don't need a hard and fast rule that it's always the private banker or it's always the commercial banker or this person is prime as it relates to the relationship. We know that all of those employee profiles want that, but the customer doesn't consistently say the same thing. What we know is we need to capture the preference of that customer and ensure whichever employee is that prime gets the benefit of the full platform, gets the benefit of the full institution. That generation of experience design and development is really newer and is much more complex, both in terms of the business rules, the commission and compensation rules, and the governance. And it's only really being seen in the very most complex and what I would consider attractive, wealthiest clients, or in the most easy to digitize, frankly, looking to serve mostly through digital clients. And we're not there where we see it across the whole spectrum, but that's what's coming next. And it's very exciting. In order to do that, though, you need to have a platform strategy for technology and data. You need to have a single way of thinking about how you make money and how you share information across those legacy silos.
Yeah, that resonates for me. And I remember kind of when I was at GemStep, we sold into one of our customers and said, okay, this is great. You're developing this beautiful customer experience for the mass market. We don't have anything near as nice in our private bank. We don't have anything that is nearly as engaging. So I've definitely come across some of what you're saying. I want to come back to what you just hit on and this platform and what you were saying earlier, the institutional view of an individual, knowing Kendra, knowing Marla, regardless who is serving her and how she might be graduating or tapping into other parts of the incumbent, of that large enterprise. How is that data flowing? And so I'm going to transition this over to Kendra. You were a very early supporter of Nomi's as we talked about going to market and empowering people to achieve their goals by being more known, by powering that institutional view and making sure that that institutional view is not only accurate, but it's dynamically updated, not in an arbitrary way at a 6-month check-in or even worse, an annual check-in, if the data is even asked, but it's updated based off of what's actually happening in the client's life. And so if you don't mind, I would be curious for you to just share a little bit more about how you see that institutional view of the individuals aligned with our vision of having someone be more known in what we call this financial identity, this kind of data layer that can then permeate through the pipes.
Yeah. And it's such an exciting time. I'm excited for Nomi. I'm excited for the industry. I'm excited that things are possible now that just weren't possible 3 years ago. So the first thing is that, early generations of client analytic records, client profiles, client archetypes always were, like cardboard cutouts, I guess, of what actually happens in human decision making. They tended to be designed without emotional considerations, without understanding the differences in the way people process or engage or feel about money, and without understanding all the nuances that exist in someone's broader financial life. And that was because we had to come up with a set of criteria or a process flow that had questions. We were really limited in what was possible. So you would take a rich conversation that would take place between two human beings, and you would have all the EQ, all the body language, all the emotion, all the unsaid things. And we wouldn't be able to figure out how to turn that into something. So we just pretended it wasn't there for a while, because something in the client profile is better than nothing in the client profile. So we deferred to KYC. We deferred to, like I said, very sort of one-dimensional archetypes. We deferred to assumptions about how people feel and what matters to them. And for a while, just getting that piece right was hard enough. Like we put a lot of effort into getting that right. And there's still places where we're not doing that consistently. But technology has really let us leapfrog. We can go way past that now. We can work with notes. We can work with unstructured data. We can work with patterns. We can work with degrees of certainty. We can listen much better at scale. And we can save space for the nuances that are more in keeping with how humans actually are. And because it's now technically possible, I believe it's our imperative to begin to use those understandings and those capabilities. And I certainly believe investors are expecting the industry to do so. So now you have to take all the things you hardwired in, like, are you a high risk or a low risk investor? Are you married or not married? Are you this or you that? Are you that? All these things that we turned into either binaries or degrees. And then we made a whole bunch of assumptions on people after. And we have to go back to first principles, which is if you were having a conversation with someone and trying to understand what mattered to them, why it mattered to them, and what they wanted to do because of what mattered to them, you would not start with a checklist. You would not start with a static data model that you were trying to fill in. You would listen to them and you would ask questions and you would respond based on what they said. And you would give them scenarios and they would respond, and it would happen over time. Trust would be built and more questions would be asked. Questions would churn into actions and then more trust would be built. That humanity is now technically supportable. And so now our industry's big sort of call to action is, let's get it more human in the way we actually provision it out into our interactions. And that's the work that I know Nomi aspires to be supportive of. I certainly see many of my clients hoping and looking to go after. And I think it's really exciting to think about not just what we can do today when we do the first pilot or the first release, but what would happen as this became the norm. And we were really engaging much more transparently, much more iteratively, in a much more democratized way with human beings, both human beings that are employees, licensed or otherwise, and human beings that are customers, whether they're your primary investor or their family.
There's so much more I could ask you about that. And that I think that, what I heard a lot was there's a reskilling on the rails of new and novel technologies. There is an opportunity here that recognizes that the way that we've been talking to and engaging our clients does need a rethink. And it's a rethink that I love your analogy to the cardboard cutouts. We kind of had a cardboard cutout and it was very two-dimensional and it was static. And we have this opportunity to change the way that we think about client engagement holistically. We always end with one question, Kendra, and it's so on that topic of humanity and our own personal relationships with money. What is one instance in your life or a conversation you've had that totally changed your own personal relationship with money?
In the summer between first and second year university, I went to McGill in Montreal. I got this amazing job working for a company called Star Data Systems. It's now CGI. And they provisioned market data to investors who were interested in the Canadian market. And I was hired by them to go and interview all their customers across Europe. It was an amazing opportunity. I was only 18 years old. I got to live in Europe, travel all over, meet with people, take them out for lunch, ask them questions. And I was given an Amex card to pay for my travel. And at the end of the summer, I called my boss and he said, well, great job. Go and have, a little bit of fun backpacking for a couple of weeks before you go back to school. And I thought that was great. And I did. And I used that Amex card. I kind of forgot that it wasn't my Amex card. And so when I came back, I owed, $4,000, basically half of what I'd made the whole summer on that Amex card. And it was a real lesson in really making sure you understand how much did I get paid this summer and whose money am I spending and what am I forgoing by living in an impulsive or living in the moment. And it was a tough lesson to learn as a young person. Luckily, I was young enough that I wasn't really exposed. I didn't have mortgage payments or any big expenses, but it was a really tough lesson. And I couldn't believe I'd done that. It didn't seem like I had spent much money, but I essentially eradicated half of the money I had made. And I did it while having a lot of fun, But then I had to pay the piper at the end, and it changed my perspective on spending. It changed my perspective on earning, and it changed my perspective on, whether or not I could afford to do certain things. And I think it was a really important and kind of embarrassing lesson to learn.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared it. It's a vulnerable story to share. I'm grateful that you shared it. I'm sure it also was a lesson in better communicating. How could that person have been when I said, go have fun, this isn't what I meant.
I didn't mean on our Amex. Yeah, exactly. I think he thought it was obvious, but an 18-year-old is not fully formed in the frontal cortex. I heard spend as much as you want traveling with your friends. And he thought I meant I could be released early from my duties. So anyway, it was very, very embarrassing to have to call him and make a payment schedule.
Thank you so much for sharing. Kendra, also thank you for offering all of your invaluable insights today on the podcast for our listeners. Everything that you shared about the evolving dynamics of wealth management. What's happening in these incumbent organizations? How have things changed? What are the difference between these up-and-comers and kind of very disruptive technologies and how they might think about how they're talking to the incumbents in order to help the incumbents with their own story, their own evolution and their own disruption. So your expertise and very, very deep exposure and hands-on work offers a clear lens through which advisors and firms, and especially the leadership of the biggest incumbents, can navigate the complexities of today's financial landscape. Kendra, where can our listeners learn more about Epok Advice and what you're building right now?
First of all, thanks for having me. I love spending time with you, and I'm a big believer in what you're building with Nomi. So happy to be supportive and happy to chat. Epok Advice seeks to serve the boards and executive teams of wealth distribution, asset management, and wealth tech organizations. And we really act as insider-outsiders, executive sounding boards, strategic stress testers. You can learn about the work that I'm doing by following me on LinkedIn or by taking a look at our website, which is epokadvice.com. Epok is spelled E-P-O-K. It's a play on the word epoch, CH, which is about the future. And our goal is really to define and support the future of advice and investing.
Perfect way to end on this podcast about the future of wealth. For our listeners, consider your relationship with change to achieve your business goals and desired outcomes. How have you experienced resistance? Has your corporate leadership experienced resistance? What type of resistance have they experienced? And how did you hear about it in this conversation we just had with Kendra? Tell me about it. Drop it in the comments. And thank you so much, Kendra, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the Knowing Me, Knowing You podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more transformative conversations to you. Until next time, keep discovering, keep growing, and remember, you're in control of your own financial story. Follow us for more conversations on financial confidence, self-discovery, and the future of money.